Hey Mike, welcome to Let's Talk Quality. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. This is
Pleasure.
exciting.
Absolutely. No, excited to get into stuff. Mike, just give the listeners like a really quick, high level. What's your role? What are you doing now?
Yeah, so currently I am the head of quality at Bristol Myers Squibb for In Vivo CAR-T, which is the next phase of CAR-T therapy where we are attempting to transduce cells inside your body as opposed to transduction ex vivo in a manufacturing plant. So all very new and exciting. Prior to this role, I was site quality head at BMS's clinical cell therapy manufacturing site, supporting autologous allogeneic CAR-T cell therapy programs. Prior to that, I've held a bunch of different roles within quality at BMS and Celgene and Abraxis Bioscience and APP before that. It's all been one acquisition or spin-off after another since I've started my career.
Yeah, so we're going to get into it, and that's one of I think the things that stood out to me when we first spoke is that you've been in the same sort of organization for a number of years now, but you've been through a number of different acquisitions. So although the organization technically hasn't changed, you've had a number of different companies, a number of different roles in that time. So just very quickly talk us through that journey from sort of start to where you are now.
Yeah, I used to joke with my wife that when we lived in Chicago that I've had the same cubicle for 6 years and I've had four different company names on the top of my paychecks. Like a lot of chemical engineers right out of college, I joined an oil and gas company and I lasted about 5 months. I realized pretty quickly that this was not my calling in life. The joke in the oil and gas industry is that all the oil in the nice places of the world has already been found. So you're living out in the middle of nowhere. I was sitting in my hotel room in a Holiday Inn Express, on my computer at night. This was right after everyone was getting on Facebook and stuff, and all my friends were moving up to Chicago and having a great time in the city, and I'm sitting there like all alone on Thanksgiving Day. So I realized pretty quickly that this was not the life for me. So I reached out to a friend of mine, a fellow chemical engineer from the University of Illinois, and he was talking about a company he had just joined called APP Pharmaceuticals. And he got me an interview. I moved up to the Chicago area, interviewed, got the job. It was a third shift, graveyard shift from midnight to 8 a.m. or something like that in the QC lab, testing in process samples and all the typical QC lab stuff. APP was a generic drug company, and I really, man, it's hard to describe how in retrospect, right? You just learn a lot, and I still think back to that time even today on how that company operated, and you've really never experienced leanness until you've worked at a generic drug company, right? You are just churning. That the place had 7 or 8 filling lines running 24/7, and you are busy. Let me tell you, like you are busy. When I first got into that job, I was just completely overwhelmed. It is nothing like the academic labs I had worked at in college, and there was just a ton of work. And I remember like I remember actually a specific evening. Actually, it was the morning because I was off work and it was 9 a.m., right? And I got home and I'm like, man, I don't know how I'm gonna stay on top of like all these batches. Your analysts were assigned by batch. So you got a batch and I was responsible for everything on that specification, HPLC, GC, all the wet chem stuff, everything on there. And I just had this huge pile of stuff. And the memory is still like very clear in my mind where I just realized that this is just a puzzle I have to solve. And I can start sample prep on this test. And while that's, digesting or whatever the case is, I can start on this other thing. And it all kind of fits together. There's, I think, a lot to be said with learning from scarcity of resources. And I think everyone who's worked in the pharmaceutical industry for long enough understand that scarcity of resources is a real thing. And having that experience very early on in my career, I just am so lucky that I happened to step into that role and, work in that sort of environment when I did, because that sort of mindset, I think you can bring with you forever, right? There is a way, there's almost always a way to make things more efficient. There's a way to structure work that just maximizes your time. Obviously, this was almost 20 years ago at this point, right? But especially when you're working in a lab, you don't have an opportunity to just close the laptop and go home and like finish the work when you're at home. Like you got to get it all done there, like in your shift. I think that those early days at APP was super beneficial. So anyway, APP had one branded product, right? One non-generic called Abraxane. And that asset eventually was spun off into its own separate company called Abraxis Bioscience. And when the companies diverged, the new company just had the one commercial asset, Abraxane. And so I went with that company with a handful of folks, and then worked on Abraxane out of our Chicago site for several years, a number of different roles: CMO oversight, third party lab oversight. I helped stand up a new manufacturing plant for the company. Then moved more into kind of a supplier quality role. It was distributed by regions, so I oversaw our suppliers and contract manufacturers primarily in Central and South America, which was again an awesome experience. And I think you learn a lot by interacting on a daily basis with external parties. You learn very quickly that when you're working outside of your own firm, or even within your own firm, this is true to a certain extent, but like people have different incentives, right? Especially when working with companies where you are not their only client. They have lots of other clients, and they're not going to make changes to their processes just because, it benefits you and your project or your program. It's very, very eye-opening. And so that was just a completely, I went from lab work to, overseeing manufacturing for a product that I was very familiar with, to then now, moving into overseeing a wide variety of CMOs, third-party labs, et cetera, in Central and South America. And also there were a couple vendors I oversaw in Italy and Japan. But I went from that like very technical type lab type work and manufacturing oversight to now, helping, regulatory affairs and our business partners structure quality agreements and make sure that our relationships with these companies are in a solid place, both from, obviously from a quality perspective first, but also just kind of overall, right? We need to be good partners, even though we're, the client, technically speaking. Around that time, this was at Celgene. They had made the decision. Celgene had acquired a number of smaller biotechs by that point, and we had kind of smaller satellite offices throughout the country. And so the company made a decision to close a lot of those satellite offices, and the office in Chicago was one of those. They gave me an option of, you have a severance agreement, or you can take this relocation package. I talked to my wife. She'd never lived outside of Illinois. I had grown up all over the country. I was born in California and grew up in Colorado, and had already lived a while in Chicago. So I had kind of moved all over, and moving to me wasn't necessarily that big of a deal. But anyway, we made the decision. We'd never lived on the East Coast before, so we took the relo package and moved out to New Jersey. That was 10 years ago now. But anyway, so yeah, moved out to New Jersey, still doing a similar role, but my idea was I'll be near headquarters of Celgene out here. And when you're working in a smaller office, the one in Chicago had maybe 60 employees in it, and the quality group was maybe 10 people, maybe or less. And there's just not a lot of options career wise, right? In that sort of situation. So my thought was, okay, well, I'll move out, and then I'll just see. I'll see. It's a reason. It's like a mid-sized company. I'll see what's available. So I moved out there and started poking around in our internal job board. one day my boss's boss called me into his office and said, "Hey, there's a new program at our site down the road that's very exciting. It's called CAR-T therapy. The program's called BB2121, just starting, they're just finishing their phase 1 trial, and the site needs help from a quality perspective. Would you be willing to take this on? And we want you to build this team for, validation, laboratory oversight." And so at the time, I didn't even know what a T cell was, but I trusted the guy, the guy that was offering me this, and yeah, kind of took the plunge. And man, that was those early days of that program were quite hectic. Tons of people being hired, manufacturing, entire manufacturing plants being stood up in record time. It was just a crazy, crazy time in my career. So then another big switch from, something in supplier quality, which was great and interesting, and I learned a lot in that role. But then to switch to this totally new modality and totally new quality mindset, not only from an autologous supply perspective, but also switching from, supporting primarily commercial programs to early phase clinical programs, was just a huge, huge shift that was required in a quality mindset. It's a lot different, for anyone in a quality group who might be listening to this and you know never having worked on a clinical program before. Like, it is massively, massively different. I think it plays to my strengths a little bit, which is that I have, I was just joking with the coworker yesterday. I have a memory of a goldfish. And I just, you read the UJRLEX and it's like hundreds of pages of, detailed regulations, and that's all great, but I can't remember all that. And the way my brain works is I have to understand first principles. And from your first principles, you can then derive whatever the question of the day might be. You can derive what is probably the right answer, right? So what I really like about working in the early phase clinical space is there is no preset right answer. There's no precedent necessarily for many of the decisions that we are required to make. And what you really need to rely on is a very solid foundation and understanding of quality first principles. So yeah, so that was that shift. When was that? That was like 8 years ago. So I've been supporting early phase clinical, cell therapy programs for about 8 years now. Just in the past couple months have transitioned over to this
Yeah.
in vivo CAR-T programs. Yeah.
Thanks for the rundown. There's a lot to sort of unpack there. I suppose one of the themes that I guess stands out throughout all of that is that you've put yourself into different positions and opportunities that you haven't necessarily been familiar with. Would that be fair to say? Like stepping into a lot of unknown territory.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And the further into my career I go, you kind of realize that every new career stage, you're stepping into the unknown. No one really knows what they're doing. Not to be too like on the nose, but
Yeah, we're all just sort of mumbling our way through it.
yeah, yeah, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you look back at your time when you first started out in science manufacturing, did you how did you see your career evolving? Was it always a case of, did you have a set sort of path that you wanted to go down, or did you just sort of go, take the opportunities as and when? Like, it's a really interesting sort of career you've had where you've stayed in the same organization and gone into different roles within various mergers and acquisitions. A lot of people, when there's an acquisition, they might see that as a chance to leave or an opportunity or potential, reason to leave the business and find a new role. But you've actually stayed and actually accelerated your career in some ways, where you've gone through those changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, but change is a fact of life. And I think the fact that I've been successful in my career over many acquisitions and spinoffs, et cetera, I think is I think there's a big component of luck to it, right? I got lucky that I happened to join the the spun off company supporting Abraxane. I got lucky that that company happened to get acquired by Celgene. I got lucky that, Celgene happened to be acquired by a great company like BMS. So I don't want to, I don't want to sit here and say that, oh well, I've had this vision and it's my own tenacity that's luck is a big part of anyone's career, and
Yeah,
I
of course.
yeah,
You
and
don't
but
get given these positions. You need a bit of
no,
done something to put yourself in those opportunities, right?
for sure, and you have to you have to work to the extent that you're in a position to take advantage when lucky breaks happen. I think that just my personal mindset is that I like solving problems, different problems. And if I'm solving the same sorts of problems day in and day out, maybe each, the nuances of each problem are different, but it just gets boring after a while. You spend a lot of time at work. You may as well enjoy what you do. And I like solving problems, and I like thinking about different topics or maybe the same topic in a different way. So, as you progress through your career, maybe that first problem I had to solve was, God, how do I stay on top of all this testing I have to do? Right. And then you kind of progress, and you're presented with different problems, and how do I uh, how do I guide a team? We just had a round of layoffs. How do I guide this team so that they can think about how to handle the workload that they're now presented with?
Yeah.
It's a different problem to solve. And if you're working out in the clinical space versus a commercial space, what are the processes you need to stand up? Quality is about how many times is the phrase written procedures mentioned in the regulatory text? Like dozens of times, right? Obviously, our regulatory agencies view our processes as the primary means by which we ensure consistent quality in our production. And so how do we structure those processes to best support fast to clinic programs, or frictionless change management? So these are maybe more abstract than how to schedule your day in a lab, but they're new and interesting problems to solve. And so I think for anyone looking at a career in pharmaceuticals, or especially within the quality unit within pharmaceuticals, having that mindset of just a curiosity you can't solve a problem unless you're actually curious on why do we do things this way? Why does this exist, and why does it exist this way and not that way, right? There's a lot to be said on that curiosity aspect of it, I think.
I agree. Yeah. You've mentioned there sort of making your own luck. You've mentioned problem solving, and to be a good problem solver, it's having that innate curiosity. Is there anything else that you think your bosses or the organization saw in you in terms of your skill set, your skills to take on new roles? Because that's what I'm really interested in figuring out. Like, I know you're humble and you say, like, a lot of it was luck, and I appreciate that. That you, but you also put you put yourself into those positions. Um, Outside of problem solving, curiosity, like where did it all sort of, how did you get those opportunities?
Well, one thing I like to say to my team or my coworkers is that I have very little fear about asking stupid questions, or what I what I think might be a stupid question. And I try to understand the context of whatever the issue is before I put a stake in the ground, right? Or create a boulder. My old boss back in the Chicago office, her name was Debbie. She's still to this day like one of the best bosses I've ever had. And she would joke with me that, you sit back in a meeting for, you know 50 minutes of an hour long meeting, and at the very end you ask like the most profound question that like makes everyone stop and like, oh wait, but that's it's because I try to understand what I'm hearing first, and I'm not trying to speak up or influence something just for the sake of
Take of it.
speaking up, right? Like you got to have something to say,
Yeah.
and you're not going to have something to say unless you fully understand the context and like the underlying principles at play, right? Because you might be talking about the, I don't know, like technical details of a stability protocol or something. I don't know. I'm just making something up. And if you don't understand, like, well, you know, why are the time points set that the way they are? Why are we testing these particular tests at these time points? And the answer for that is going to be different depending on what program or product you're discussing. But if you don't understand, at least like philosophically or conceptually, why things are structured the way they are, you're really not going to be able to interrogate that or ask smart questions or make sure that we're on the right path. So I was always very good at that. I don't know. I don't know if I can really like explain really the thought process. That's just how my brain works. And I think if you just do that consistently, I think that, managers start to notice and they, it's not like it's one thing to get your daily tasks done. I think it's then another thing to understand why are you doing these daily tasks. That is like super, super important. Why are we doing this? Why am I, filling out this form and submitting it to this other functional group and, waiting for a response, whatever the case is? Because if you don't understand why, then you don't have a prayer in beginning to formulate an idea of how can we make this more efficient or how can we make this faster or less resource intensive.
Yeah.
Um, and part of that is because I hate filling out forms, right? Like
Yeah.
I just, I'm like, oh God, we have a form to fill out. Is there any way to get rid of this?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. But I think it's just that curiosity mindset of why is something structured the way that it is?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a good reason for it.
Yeah.
But Himesh, like I don't want to put a percentage on it, but a huge proportion of the time a process is the way it is because someone, I don't know, 7 years ago had a deadline and they needed to write this SOP by this date and get it effective to like close a kappa or something. And like, it's version one of that SOP, which is great. Version one is the hardest version to write, but there wasn't necessarily any like deep reasons why that particular process works the way that it does. And I think that there's always room for improvement. Like one of my chemical engineering professors told us it was a process design class for chemical processes, not like business processes or anything. And he said something like 5% of the United States electricity goes towards running centrifugal pumps, which is just an astounding number, right? That's like 5% of all electricity generated in the country is used for just running these pumps. And he said, as a chemical engineer, you have to understand that the parameters and the pressure and the spin rate of these pumps, more likely than not, is not set up optimally. Someone just set it and it happens to work and then they're doing it. But there is a huge amount of savings and efficiency gains just just sitting there to take, right? And he was a process engineer and before he was a professor he was worked in industry and I think he was trying to motivate some of us to go into process engineering, that like, hey, there are interesting problems here to solve. But I think he's absolutely right about that, not only with the case of pumps or whatever you're talking about, but also just in terms of business process. There's all sorts of reasons why something was set up initially. Maybe
Yeah.
it was for good reasons, maybe not. But
Yeah. But you having that deep curiosity and inquisitive nature about you, it makes sense how you've put yourself in that position to take on new roles. And it makes sense that how you've continued to do that, because when you go into a new role where you are stepping into maybe an unknown or something slightly different, you're not afraid to ask the questions and you're not afraid to look into traditional processes which may be out of date or not built for today's purpose. So is that fair? Is that sort of the approach that you've taken when you've gone into these new positions, like, you know, going into the CAR-T world where you haven't had experience prior to that in that space? Is really just not being afraid to ask questions, really diving into it and taking it head on?
I mean, yeah, from my perspective, yeah, it's not just about like furthering your career. It's about, I think we touched on this earlier in our conversation, but like, and it's a cliche, but change is constant, and there's no way to avoid it. And if you don't have that inquisitive nature, as you said, you're just gonna get buried, right? You know, and I'm not. This isn't even like a quality thing. This is
I
just
agree.
in general, right? You have to have a willingness to learn something new, and you have to have some element of curiosity.
It's the difference between A players and B players, you know, if you had to use those terms, whatever capacity you're working in, whatever career, whatever profession, if you're not willing to put yourself out there and ask those questions and be curious and really look at yourself, self-development and figure out how do you get better and improve, you're not gonna get better. The best people I've worked with are those who are constantly developing themselves, constantly seeking out feedback to try and improve.
Yeah, or like putting proposals in front of your boss on like, hey, this method is a real pain. Like, I have an idea for how to improve it, and I would tell my team like, if you have any idea on like if you find like a particular SOP or work practice or method or whatever that just doesn't make sense to you, like ask the question, bring it to me or bring it to your direct manager. We would love to hear, people ask how to get ahead in your career. Like, dude, there's no better way than bringing a proposed improvement to your boss,
Why do
right?
you think people are scared to ask those questions? If you were to draw on the people that you've worked with over the years?
I think that I mean, I don't know if there's one particular reason. I think it's probably a mixture and depends on the person. I think some people probably are overwhelmed with their current workload and just don't have time to think about, right? They have a stack of papers this high in their inbox, and they just got to get through it. I think that some people probably do think that processes are in place for a well thought out reason, and that unlikely to think of they're unlikely to think of a better process to implement, which is not true, right? As we've been discussing.
Mm.
I think there's some below average bosses out there that don't want to hear good ideas. Maybe that manager put in place that system and they're like very protective of it. I'm
Yeah,
sure that happens too, right? You got to kind of navigate. You got to have some awareness of the whatever you want to call it, like office politics or whatever. But yeah, I think it's probably a mixture of things. But I think if you're thinking about these sorts of topics and you have this kind of curiosity and it's just about shots on goal, right? Even if you don't have time, and you know still though there's got to be that spark, right? Where like, God, man, and I guarantee it's happened to everyone. Like, God, why is it why do we have to do it this way?
yeah,
And even if you have a thought on like, maybe it's not fully mature, maybe it's not fully fleshed out, but just start. That's what you have one-on-ones with your boss. That's why those exist. Like, just start spitballing. Like, what can we do here? What is there any sort of, and I gotta tell you, like, those sorts of, as a manager myself, like those sorts of conversations with my team, like I just love that stuff. It's just great. It's great. And look, I mean, part of it sometimes, you got to say like, actually, the process is in place. It's structured this way for a reason. It has to be this way. Okay,
yeah,
well, that's okay. Then you move on to the next thing.
yeah,
It's not,
yeah,
personal or anything
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
And then look, I mean, look, I've left groups because the manager is not amenable to improvements, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you get supervisors or managers that just don't
Yeah.
have that mindset.
Yeah.
And then I've looked for other roles. You don't have to stay in that role,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? But it's
Yeah.
just it's about like long-term averages, right? There's not going to be like one single idea that blows everyone's mind and like, oh, this is so awesome, you're going to get a promotion. Like that almost never happens. But it's just about that constant, consistent mindset, and over time, if you have any manager or supervisor, worth worth anything, they're going to notice.
Yeah. Is there a question that when you're interviewing people that you wish that people would ask you more?
My favorite interview question is, tell me about a time where you had to start a project or initiative without having all the information that you would ideally like to have. And what I'm getting at with that question is, you're in reality, you're never going to have all the information you need. What I'm looking for is an enterprising individual who is not afraid to go out within, internal company resources, externally, like looking up whatever resources that you need to help gather the information that you think is relevant. That is super, super important. And I like that question.
If that's a question that you ask people that you're interviewing, is that right?
Hmm.
What
Yep.
about the flip side? And it doesn't necessarily have to be people that you're interviewing, but people you're interviewing or people in your team. Are there any questions that you wish that they would ask you more often, or they would ask anyone?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood your question.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Man, it's funny when you're interviewing, like most people just don't ask a lot of questions.
It's often a good sign, isn't it, of the caliber of the individual? Is the quality of the questions they ask.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that it would be nice to, when you're interviewing for a new role, or at a new company, or wherever, it's as much about you interviewing the manager as they're interviewing you, right? And it's easy for me to say that, right? I think fit is a really important component. And so if you're interviewing, you really should be asking a lot of questions about company culture, and what sort of continuous improvement mindset. Like, are you the type of company that, you can't ask this directly, right? But trying to get at the like, one of the fundamental questions is, like, are you the kind of company that appreciates like iterative innovation? Like, are you okay with us with trying a couple different ways of solving a problem, and seeing where it goes? Or are you the kind of, are trying to discern as if this is the kind of company that maybe you know you need to get months and months and months of discussion before we make any sort of change? I think that's like, getting to try that type of culture component is really important. And I think understanding that helps you not only understand, like, perhaps the type of work that you'll be doing, but also it gives you a little bit of insight into how the management culture thinks about things, right? Are they open to new ideas? Like, just like what we've been talking about the past hour, are they
Yeah,
open to new ideas or not? Are they okay with failure, right? Sometimes you try something new, and it just doesn't work, and that's okay, right? I think trying to, I don't know if I can come up with maybe necessarily a particular, like, concrete question you should ask off the top of my head right now, but trying to understand how the company thinks about those sorts of topics, because those are all integrally linked to the quality mindset. I think would be really important. And I think, depending on their answers to that, it'll really give you a lot of insight on, do they think of quality as truly like a continuous improvement type function, or are they, thinking of it more in a post hoc reactive type manner?
Mike, I'm conscious of time. I've enjoyed this conversation. There's some really good insights into, like, your mindset, what sort of career arc that you've gone through and how you've navigated those different changes. And, it all makes sense to me. I think for people that are earlier on in their career, particularly, there's a lot of wisdom there that people can lean on. So thanks for sharing all of that. One quick fire question just to finish things. If you were to go back 20 years in your career, a young Mike asked you for advice, what would you say to him back when you were starting out?
I think the biggest regret career-wise is that there was a couple years span when I was in that supplier quality group that I probably stayed in that role a little too long. And I think I would tell younger Mike, not to be afraid of not jumping, but exploring new roles more frequently. But that said, I think everybody has different career paths, and I think that there's something to be gained even from maybe non-ideal roles. You can learn a lot in those sorts of situations too. Maybe not at the time, but certainly in hindsight, it's sunk cost, right? You can't get that time back. You may as well reflect on it and try to understand um, what can I take away from this. And so, in terms of like regrets career wise, I don't know. I think I sound like a hippie, right? But like you just got to go with the flow, man. The industry is constantly changing. Don't be afraid to explore new options. That's totally fine. So yeah, I think that's if I could tell my younger self one thing, I think it'd probably be don't worry about the testing you have to do tomorrow or the whatever the quality agreement that you have to write by next month. That's all. It's all very short term, and you already know how to do that, and you can do that just by hours, right? That I think what's also important is just keep an awareness, like keep your eyes above the waterline a little bit, and just have some sort of awareness on what other opportunities or more interesting roles maybe floating around out there, because you never know.
Thank you, Mike. That's been brilliant. I really appreciate your time and
Yeah,
wisdom.
thanks
That's
for
been really
having
good.
me.
Yeah, no, absolute pleasure. Best of luck for everything over the next year or the rest of the year. We'll have to have you on in a couple of years and see what the next stage of your journey's been. But
I'm gonna have like much longer beard. Like, man, did I go with the flow?
few more gray hairs. No, I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Pleasure.